right across the country are struggling to address homelessness. As housing prices increase and supply is in desperate demand, folks are going to continue to struggle, particularly young folks who are significantly impacted.
On a rainy, cold December morning, 3 days before Christmas, I did the unthinkable, and I sold the only item I had left in the world, which was a pair of boots. And I remember I walked out of the place where I sold them, and my foot touched that cold concrete sidewalk. And honestly, Tony, I just didn't want to be here anymore.
Today's episode's going to hit close to home for me, and I have to believe for all of you. We're going to delve into an issue that deeply troubles us: the growing number of people in our country who are unhoused. It breaks my heart to see so many people living in their cars and tents and shelters, couch surfing, without a place to truly call their own. And the mental health crisis that comes with it. So I feel immense gratitude each day when I walk through my front door into a home where I know I belong, where everything's familiar, where I can welcome friends and family. The sense of belonging and security is something I wish everyone could experience. And they should in a country as wealthy as ours. It's alarming and deeply saddening that this problem is not only present but growing. As I stated earlier, the mental health issues that come with it, the economic challenges, the lack of dignity, and more importantly, the lack of affordable housing. We need to confront these issues head on and find sustainable solutions. Today, I'm honored to speak with Joe Roberts, the Skid Row CEO, whose remarkable journey from homelessness to becoming a successful entrepreneur, author, motivational speaker is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
For how so many years I had all this potential and value, but I didn't treat myself with any respect. How could I expect the world to value who I was? Something I've learned along my journey is that each individual human being and soul has such huge value.
This is Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Joe's advocacy work, particularly through the Push for Change campaign, has made a tangible impact on raising awareness and funds for youth homelessness in Canada. Joe, thanks for joining me today. I used AI, I looked at your tapes, excerpts, people that have attended your speeches and stuff, and you just are a remarkable human being, and I hope I do justice to your story.
Thanks for having me on the program. Although I would say, just to sort of offset that a bit, I don't think I'm particularly special, Tony. I had access to resources. I'm a common story of someone who bounces back, finds recovery, and moves forward. I'm just kind of loud and from the stage with it. You know what I mean?
And I think that's a fair point, and we're certainly going to get into the need for having resources and some of the people that helped you along the way. First of all, I want to just say, as a marketer, I loved this concept of framing your entire journey into 3 words: Skid Row CEO. How did that come about? Because that to me is just, it's so compelling that I have to open up that book and dive deeper into Joe's life.
Yeah, I'd love to take credit for it, but it wasn't me. It was actually the Province newspaper out here in Vancouver when I won the Courage to Come Back award in 2003, so 21 years ago. That was the moniker they gave me, and there was some of us were sitting around the table saying, "Boy, that just really kind of covers it in 3 words: from Skid Row to CEO." And so it stuck. Courage just had their annual event, the 26th version of that the other night. And so that's where that started. Even
before the Skid Row, when you hit Skid Row, there's obviously Joe the child. And I want to talk a little bit about these 2 polar opposite males that really influenced your life. And the first was your dad. He was your hero. So tell me a little bit about what he was all about. Well,
I grew up in a lower middle class family in Midland, Ontario, so an hour and a half north of Toronto. Dad worked at the seatbelt factory. He worked for Decor Metal. It's called something else now. He was a great dad. He loved being a dad. He was a hockey coach, baseball coach. In his shadow, I felt loved, safe, and protected. He used to say things to me like, "I love you. You can do and be anything." Unfortunately, Dad passed away really young. I was 8 years old. Dad was 35, and just like that, our family trajectory changed. I lost my dad. Our family lost our economic security. My mom lost her partner in this relationship. So what happened next was mom remarried. The only problem is the man who came into my life next couldn't be more polar opposite to my father. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. So I went from a dad who said things like, I love you, you can do anything, to a man who'd say things like, you're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything.
How do you deal with that? Because you're 8 years old when your dad dies. How soon after did your mom remarry?
Relatively quickly, but I don't fault her for that. You have to understand, Tony, this is the early 1970s. She's got a mortgage to pay. She's got to put food on the table for these 3 kids, age 5, 8, and 11. Right. So I think it was the actual marriage didn't happen for some years. It was the coming together and co-sharing that house together and living together. I think that happened about a year after Dad died.
And did you ever have any resentment that how's she moving on and I'm still dealing with the loss of this hero? Or were you just too early to even compartmentalize that?
No, I don't think so. At 8 years old, I had a whole bunch of, you got to remember, there's 2 things that happen at once. One, the trauma of losing Dad. Grief is huge. I mean, look at the last 4 years. With COVID and human grief is probably one of the biggest things that we navigate in our time. So I hadn't dealt with that. And then I had this ongoing verbal, physical, and emotional abuse from stepdad. So I wasn't really blaming mom, and never really have, because she was also caught in a cycle of domestic violence. So she had her own stuff. She was always trying to get in between me and stepdad. For some reason, I was the target. My little sister didn't get it. My older brother didn't get it, but I was the target. And I think it had a lot to do with a very warm relationship I had with my mom.
So your mom's trying to get in the middle. That's obviously causing friction and stuff. But when did you start turning to alcohol and drugs as sort of a means of sort of trying to find some element of escape? So
that sort of happened. My brother was always someone I looked up to, and I wanted to belong to his group. He was 3 years older than me, and you know how brother sister rivalry, so he invited me and with his older friends to experiment, and I joined. And I didn't join because I thought it would be cool or I was curious about drug consumption. I joined to belong. Johann Hari wrote in Chasing the Scream, the opposite of addiction isn't recovery. The opposite of addiction is connectedness or community. That's what I was seeking, because I didn't fit in at school. I was weird and awkward, didn't fit in at home. Boom. This group of people said, hey, join us. And I joined, and and then what happened is, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't as scared. And so it became a protection mechanism. Think of the last 4 years. What is it that you used or leaned on when things get uncertain or scary? Sometimes it's food or social media or escapism. Sometimes it's a positive habit like exercise or writing or journaling or yoga. For me, I found a way to stay safe in a very, very uncertain world.
And when did that sense of belonging and experimenting become less recreational and becoming something that you needed to have? You became quite dependent on it.
Well, I would say right from the get-go, it was medicinal. It wasn't social as much as it was. As soon as I found, hey, I can feel okay here, that became the go-to. The problem is it set a series of domino effects. And by the time I was 14 or 15, the consequences were starting to show up in my life in serious ways. I was non-compliant at home. I was getting into trouble in school, in the community. At 15, I got kicked out of the house. At 16, I got kicked out of school. And at 17, I was in trouble with the legal system.
And by the time you were 15, when you got kicked out of the house, it wasn't like you had a safe landing. What I read, that you were started to live on the streets.
Well, not right away. See, that's the misnomer with youth homelessness, is I was couch surfing. I was invisibly homeless. Okay. So a lot of youth, when they get in a fight with mom or dad in Brampton or Mississauga and they slam the door and they go out, they don't really have a plan. They grab whatever they need for the night or the next couple of days. And if they're lucky, they got a good safe couch to land on, or an uncle or an aunt or a grandma or a girlfriend's parents' place. For me, I was couch surfing. So I wasn't visibly homeless. At 15 years old, I wasn't, sitting in front of the liquor store with a cardboard sign. That happened later. But make no mistake, there was a high level of vulnerability in those first, 90 days. And statistically, we know that. Like when you look at the research from Homeless Hub and the Canadian Alliance and Away Home Canada, those early weeks are really, really crucial to wrap around a young person. This is why I like organizations like Covenant House, who do a really good job at trying to get and reach that young person before a lot more happens when they're out in the streets spinning for prizes.
What I'd learned about when I was reading about you, that this became a fairly steep downward spiral, a combination of drugs, your mental wellness, maybe running out of couches to surf on. Can you just frame for the audience how, when you felt completely alone in this world?
Yeah. So the degradation happens slowly. It's kind of like the boil the frog, a degree at a time. I wore my welcome out in the Midland Barrie area, decided I was going to go to Vancouver at 18 years old, jumped on a Greyhound bus, landed in Vancouver. It was Expo 86. But now I'd moved away from family. I'd moved away from oversight. I'd moved away from a school that I could have reintegrated. I'd certainly moved away from mom, who had her eyes on me. And I found myself in the streets of Vancouver, and things went from bad to worse. And before my 20th birthday, I was now graduating into more dangerous drugs and dangerous ways of using those drugs, pushing a shopping cart and living under a viaduct. On my worst day, going through opiate withdrawal, sitting at Pigeon Park on a rainy, cold December morning, 3 days before Christmas, I did the unthinkable, and I sold the only item I had left in the world, which was a pair of boots. And I remember I walked out of the place where I sold them, and my foot touched that cold concrete sidewalk. And honestly, Tony, I just didn't want to be here anymore. Like, life hurt so much. The walls were closing in so bad. And for years, I lived in that illusion of self-sufficiency. The heaviest thing I ever lifted was my hand for help. I didn't know how to ask for help, because when I was growing up, you learned that nobody was coming to save you. And so, that wasn't an instinct of mine to say, hey, can you help me with this? It is today. But in that moment, I reached out, I said a little prayer, I asked for help, and I made a promise on a street corner that if I ever got a second chance, I would pay it forward. How
did you survive, though? I mean, you talk about it, shopping cart and living under it. I mean, there has to be skills that you learn to just get through the day, to not be attacked, to feel some sense of, I can imagine you can never feel a sense of belonging, but at least some sense of existence.
Here, think about this. The last 4 years, we've dealt with more uncertainty, starting with the first quarter of 2020 when COVID hit. Human beings are incredibly resilient. We learn how to adapt. I woke up every single morning with unsolvable problems and somehow had to carry on. We've all done that. And what ends up happening over time is that when you're thrust into that environment, you build really strong neural pathways and you get creative. I learned how to sharpen my communication skills. I learned how to see creative solutions and ideas. I learned I learned what a really tough day looked like. And honestly, a tough day is not a 600-point drop in the Dow. A tough day is sleeping behind a dumpster. So you adapt, you grow, you learn. And what's so interesting about that is those became my greatest asset. When I was in front of those kids on Vancouver Island, sharing that message, that lived experience, they were leaning forward. Access to their minds and hearts is the gift that comes from that experience. But I don't think I'm particularly special in that. We all have that ability to adapt.
You're being very kind to yourself, but when there's so much uncertainty, how is it possible that you're developing survival skills and skills that you can take with you the rest of your life?
It's funny you say that. One of the guests that you just had on recently was Malcolm Gladwell. And in his book, Blink, he talks about having these skill sets. The streets gave me that sense. And it's interesting. I've tried to explain to people what it is that I picked up or what it is that I have when I'm in a boardroom or a sales call or I'm standing in front of 1,000 people at a conference. But that empathy piece, that ability to read a room, I don't know, there's just a whole bunch of intrinsic value that comes from that negative life experience. So when we layer that onto people and what's going on today, I think that there's an enormous amount of that blink that has happened from COVID in the last 4 years that may be just sitting there dormant, waiting for people to tap. But experience is the lens that we see life through that gives us context.
I've read by the time you're 24, you say you've hit bottom, you're exhausted both physically and mentally, no path forward. Did you ever think that it would be easier just to leave this life? Or did you realize, was there always something inside you that said something out there is worth fighting for?
My experience, I vacillated in between hopelessness and a belief in something beyond. It depended on the day of whether I was going to entertain hopelessness or there's something beyond this. The thing is that, having fun and using drugs and pain and misery before you're 20 and after you're 20 are different experiences. And I started to lose friends and I started to get scared, and I remember one day sitting on a park bench in front of Army and Navy. There was I had probably one of the most important leadership discussion I ever had in my life. I was sitting beside this guy named Gus, an older gentleman. He had these beautiful blue eyes filled with love and compassion. And he looked at me and he said, "Joe, there's more to you than you can see." And in that moment, I was a dirty, disheveled, selfish, rough around the edges, street involved young person, dirty clothes, scruffy beard, But he looked beyond how I was presenting and he spoke to my potential, my possibility. Shortly after that, and selling the boots, I reached out to my mom. I asked for help. She came out to Vancouver, brought me back to Ontario, set me up in her basement in Midhurst, Ontario. And in many ways, Mom provided that housing first strategy for me.
Was the stepdad still around?
No. What had happened is when I left the house and went out to Vancouver, she finally divorced him and he was living in an SRO in downtown Barrie. Unfortunately, too, that's sort of how his story ended. And what's interesting about that is I hated this guy. Like I remember people in recovery saying, "You got to forgive him." I didn't want to. Like he had done some serious damage to Mom, me, my brother, sister, our family. But when he passed away, I remember not feeling that sense of victory or not feeling that elation. And it hit me. But for the grace go I. He was just a guy struggling with his own demons and he just never found a day of sobriety. And that's kind of sad. And hurt people. And I've since forgiven him because you can't really move forward in this life carrying around a burlap sack full of hate and resentment.
Before I get into it, there's two things that you said that I want to just do a sidebar because part of this is lessons in life. You talked about on the streets, you had to learn to survive every day. And within that, you developed some and honed some skills. Do you think that today our youth has that opportunity, or do we give too much of life on a silver platter? And I'm not talking about when you're leaving school, but I'm just saying track meets, they no longer measure your time. Everybody gets a medal for participation. We don't want to have failure or success. We don't want to have winners or losers. We just want this level playing field. Do you think in some ways that could be hurting their ability to develop some of the skills you developed in a much more traumatic situation?
Yes and no. See, the danger is that the older generation always judges the younger generation by their context. So it's tough. I don't know. Time will tell. My experience on the street, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. However, for me, it's given me some mad skills. Young people today who have grown up with the internet in their pocket, who have maybe had a little bit more leeway and not as much accountability, that may produce something negative, might produce something extraordinary. We don't know. Like the last thing I would want for anybody is to be living in the downtown east side, but it gave me the ability to communicate. It gave me perspective and hard work. It gave me that spidey sense. It gave me the ability to solve unsolvable problems. When I got into the business world, it was like I saw the matrix. So when I look at young people today, like my daughter's 21, she's in her third year at uni. She has a very, very unique experience that will color the rest of her life. She graduated high school during COVID. There's all of the stuff that's going on for her today. So I'm not sure. Now, one of the things that I have subscribed to is Dr. Carol Dweck's work on effort-based leadership. So get kids interested in taking steps forward. I do believe that our possibility comes to the surface when we move forward in the face of negative emotion. So that's how I try to lead. That's how I try to parent. But yeah, to sort of cast the net broad on that, I think is just like my mom saying she didn't like Zeppelin. So I just have to be careful that way.
No, it's a fair point. And talk to me about when your mom flew out to see you in Vancouver and to bring you back home. What did you look like to her, do you think?
I think she was scared. I was 155 pounds and I had scabs on my face and I was emaciated. I had, hollowed out cheeks. I looked like a living skeleton. And I remember the hug. She didn't say anything. But I remember the hug she gave me was the hug of a mom who was scared. And she gave me this bear hug and whispered in my ear, "I love you. Let's get you the help you need." And brought me back to Ontario, and then fought to try and get me into, a detox and then a treatment center.
And how hard was it for you to clean up? Because intent and actually holding that intent, I hear, is one of the hardest gauntlets to run when you're an addict.
It was absolutely brutal because here's the thing. It didn't just happen. I didn't just go to mom's and then clean up. I went to mom's. And now I was away from the street. I was away from illicit drugs. My health began to improve. I had a place to do my laundry, but I still had that early trauma that was driving that substance use disorder. So I continued to drink and drug. And one night, I was quite despondent and threatening to hurt myself. My mom came into my room, and I was sitting there with a weapon. And she called the OPP. And that night, a guy named Constable Scott McLeod diffused this incredibly dangerous situation, which got me an ambulance ride to Royal Victoria Hospital, their mental health unit, and then a referral into drug treatment. But to answer your question, Tony, by the time I got to that place, I couldn't see myself going back. I was so afraid of what would happen if I relapsed or tried. So from that period, the dominoes started to drop for me. There were many days where I got scared and I wanted to run. And when I say run, I wanted to escape through alcohol and drugs, but I didn't. I found a community. I went down to Belleville. I found myself in this drug treatment program for 6 months, which led to a referral to go back to community college. I went to Loyalist. And now I was in this smaller community with this really great group of folks around me. And I started to use the tools, and days turned into weeks and months. And I started to build this foundation or stability. Were there dark days where I wanted to run? You bet. There still are, there's I got decades, but I still have, when the emotional stuff comes up for me, the way that triggers in my brain is different for other people.
I can only imagine. And when you're going to school and you graduate with honors and stuff, but there must have been many times where you're around schoolmates that are doing drugs, drinking. How did you cope with that? Not so much even your desire to do it, but just to establish your journey and having them accept that.
I think it's like anything. It's just really clear boundaries. They say you don't go and sit in a barber's seat if you don't want to get a haircut. So I wasn't hanging out in the pub on Thursday night on chicken wing night. I was doing something else. And I was also transparent. After a certain period of time, I saw it to be an asset of mine to let people know, look, that's part of my journey. So no, I don't drink. I don't do weed. No judgment. Knock yourself out. That's not my gig. I'm doing this thing over here. And it's still like that. There's a bunch of things in my life that I don't do. When I get invited, to go and do those things, I just opt out.
You graduate and you get a job, and then you turn that into another job, and you're doing really well. People are seeing leadership, and people are seeing all sorts of things come out. That, as you said, and I think it was in your book, they're saying it was the survival instincts I used in the street and the hustling and everything else that I learned in